Okay, hello everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? All good? Okay. I think there might still be a few more people filtering in, but we're going to go ahead and get started so that we don't hold you guys too late. First of all, I want to thank you guys so much for making time away from your family and friends and coming to spend it with us. I do want to remind you guys to have your phones on silent or vibrate during the next hour, please. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. So, Jon Steinman has studied and worked with co-ops across North America for over 25 years. He's the author of 2 books. One of them some of you may have seen at our farmers market booth. The first is called This Could Be Ours, and it's a photo album type display of co-ops across the country, across the North America, I think. And his second book is called Grocery Story, The Promise of Food Co-ops in the Age of Grocery Giants. He's served as president of the board at Kootenay Co-op in Canada and produced a podcast, television, and web series. So he's got a lot of experience, and those are just a few of his qualifications. If you guys want to find out more, please go to his website. He has a ton of information on there, and I think you guys are going to be really excited about what he has to say. As president of the board, my name is Alyssa, by the way, I'm sorry. As president of the board, I wanted to just personally thank you again for your time and let you know that we are so excited to be pursuing a spot at Block 67. And many of you have heard that we have a partnership on the horizon with an organization called Fresh Foods. And some of you may have even been in their stores. So that's something that you can look forward to hearing more about from us. And if there's a few minutes at the end, I do have a special guest that I want to introduce and give you guys a couple more little tidbits of information about what's next. Thank you so much. Please welcome Jon.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and wonderful to return to Hillsboro. This is my 3rd time visiting, and were any of you with me in 2019 when I was here? No? Okay. Well, wonderful to be back. And the reason I'm here in this area is I was at a conference in Portland called Organicology, hosted by a company based out of Portland called the Organically Grown Company. And some of the leaders in the organic food movement were there from way back in the 1970s. And so it was quite an honor for someone like me who was born in 1980 to go and meet a lot of these folks who have certainly inspired me and have inspired the food co-op movement. You know, much of the food co-op movement, as I'll talk about in just a little bit, was very much propelled during the 1970s. And the reason why so many startups are starting to emerge over the past 15, 20 years here in the US particularly is because of the success of the 1970s era co-ops. And so anyway, that's why I'm here. And I had been in touch with Tim last time I was here in 2022, Tim, who's on your board of directors. And one thing that I'm passionate about is supporting communities who want to create an alternative grocery store in their communities. And so I reached out to him and said I'll be in the area, and that's why I'm here today. So just so I get a sense as to where all of you are on this journey, who here is here to learn about the Hillsboro Food Co-op or learn about food co-ops for the first time? Quite a few of you. Okay, that's good to know. So I'll steer myself in that direction at times. So the design of, I guess, this time we have together, I was going to offer a little bit of an opening as to what's been motivating me recently, in particular in the past couple of months. I want to present a case for co-ops and food co-ops in particular. I want to speak a little bit about this unique idea of partnering with an existing grocer that was just sort of introduced. It's something that I'm not as familiar with, but there are some similar examples, particularly in Canada, where I'm from, if you haven't yet been able to hear my accent, which I can never hear, but I just assume now. And then for those of you who are, I hope at that point, if you're not already motivated to be a part of this food co-op initiative here, I want to offer some ideas for how you might leave this room today and tonight and be able to talk about food co-ops with your friends and with your community, because it's not easy. Like, I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm still having to reimagine how I engage with someone, whether it's for 2 sentences or 10 minutes or an hour. Like, how am I going to talk about why this is important? And I do think this is one of the most important things communities can do for themselves. And I know that to be true because I've been a part of a food co-op for almost 20 years now. I was a board director of a food co-op for 10 years, and I've visited 170 co-ops, I believe, including many startups, dozens of them. And food communities with food co-ops, I can just feel are much healthier. And I don't mean that just like physically, but just it's a healthier community when there's a food co-op that is helping support the community beyond just selling good food. And so I'll be sharing some of that today. So I wanted to just speak to something that's more recent that I've been learning as a Canadian over these past couple of months. As I'm sure you all know, Canada has been kind of rallying around this idea of sovereignty. And something that has come up in Canada is something that in my lifetime, 45 years old now, I've never seen the entire country rally around something. And I'm not going to get into the details as to why that is, but what inspires me, because that's not why we're here, but what inspires me about that is just the way in which people, when they sense something that is urgent or an emergency, how quickly people mobilize and how quickly people unite. And so you're probably familiar with how up until just a couple of months ago, politically, Canada was quite divided. And somehow around this one particular issue, a lot of those divisions have just simply fallen away. And it's familiar, I think, to me, and as I imagine to some of you too, through that previous kind of period of disruption and change 5 years ago to this week, there were also many examples of people putting aside differences and divisions to support one another, unlike I had also ever seen before. And so why I want to bring that up is because one of the challenges I find in making a case for food co-ops and trying to gain interest in a community is that co-ops are responding to something very, very urgent. They're responding to many issues that I think are very urgent, but a lot of that urgency has evolved over a very slow period of time, some a little more quicker than others. But there are dozens of issues that co-ops are responding to, but they're responding to something that we might not see as acutely as something like a pandemic, or as the fires in LA, I think, demonstrated, the way that communities were all of a sudden supporting one another in such a beautiful way. And so part of, what I do in the book that I wrote, that I'll speak of in just a moment, was to try to outline some of this long emergency, as I guess you might call, over the past really 125 years through the evolution of grocery stores and through the evolution of co-ops. And one of the reasons why I'm so committed to traveling and coming and visiting communities like yours is I know that in every community across the US and across Canada, that every community has the capacity to do what you're trying to do, which is build a community-owned grocery store. And I know that to be true because I've seen it in every kind of community. No matter rural communities, urban communities, food co-ops are able to succeed in every community. And the one thing that differentiates the co-ops that succeed versus those that don't is commitment. And it's being able to see the urgency that I certainly see and that I hope I can somewhat convey tonight. It's that commitment. And so your co-op's already demonstrated some serious commitment because 10 years ago was when this idea was conceived in Hillsboro, and there is still momentum. Here you are, this is the momentum, right? That is commitment. And so I know that commitment's here. And so I want to hopefully start to propel more of that commitment, more of that vision. And so if there's any outcome I hope from tonight, it's that it's not going to be a matter of wondering if this is going to happen. It's going to be when is this going to happen and how is this going to happen. And I hope it's also going to mean how are you, each of you, going to get involved in this initiative, whether it's volunteering, investing in the co-op's capital campaign, which may come in the near future, maybe considering joining the board of directors, of which I've done at my co-op where I live in British Columbia for 10 years. I'm not there anymore as a board director, but it was one of the most fulfilling and rewarding things, so much so that I went and wrote a book about food co-ops. So that's the testimonial to what can happen if you join the board. You're going to write a book. Yeah. So I want to speak to one other piece here too around I'm gonna fast forward. So one of the challenges I've noticed in communities with co-ops, I talk about this kind of like slow build to people, for people to realize that maybe a cooperative, which I'll speak to of what that is in just a moment, why they're important. In the same way, co-ops that have been around in communities for a very long period of time, there's also this thing that happens where people start to forget that they actually are part of a co-op. And so I'm going to give you an example of what I've started to do to sometimes wake people up to the fact that some of them are already a part of a co-op. And so, yes, I wrote a book. I used to be in radio, I was in television, but a few other things that I do and I'm involved in is that I own a bank. My bank has $300 million in assets and $300 million in customer deposits. I also own a fleet of 25 vehicles, and there's pickup trucks and cars, and they're spread out in communities all around where I live. I own a small radio station, community radio station. I own a flour mill, and I also own a grocery store. So this is a very different way of describing that I am one of many owners of a credit union. Who here is a member of a credit union? So you all own a bank. And this often gets lost. Even the credit unions themselves often forget to communicate that you are all owners of your bank, of your financial institution. So I own this bank with 4,000 people. Who here knows how many others you own the bank with? But some of you here are all owners together of a bank. I think that's pretty cool. So usually if I start to introduce myself this way, I don't know if some of you had this experience, but I've heard it from others that they start to wonder who's this capitalist tycoon who's come here from Canada to talk about all the things he owns. But no, I'm one of 4,000 owners of the Nelson and District Credit Union. I'm one of 300 owners of the Kootenay Car Share Co-op. We own 25 vehicles. We have pickup trucks, electric vehicles, low-speed electric vehicles like this cool one here that can only stay within the city itself. Nelson's a small place. It's about 10,000 people. And there's some cars in some of the smaller communities. I own a radio station, one of 2 cooperative radio stations in Canada. One is in Nelson, the other is in Vancouver, British Columbia. I also forgot to mention that I own a network of gas stations all through the region. So this is the Slocan Valley Co-op. And they just, or we, see, and this is the thing, I have to sometimes correct myself. I say they, but in fact it's now we, now that I am an owner. But we opened up a store or a station with a convenience store in Nelson. So that's where and when I became an owner and a member. And just last year, the Slocan Valley Co-op purchased a restaurant. So I'm now an owner of a pub and a restaurant. And I mentioned I'm an owner of a flour mill. And so with 35 other people, we purchased for $3,000 this flour mill. And we purchased local grain from about an hour and a half away. And we each have a key to this space, and we can use it to mill our own grain into fresh flour. And I also own a grocery store. And this grocery store, which is the main floor there, of course, is owned by 18,000 people in the region. Again, 11,000 people in Nelson, and this is owned by 18,000 people. And so this co-op has been around since 1975. We've been in this building for about 10 years, and I'm going to speak a little more about it as well. But I want to also speak of why co-ops are important. And here's an important quote that I share in my book from another author from British Columbia. And he writes, "The absence of democracy in economics is a permanent threat to the survival of democracy in politics." And who wants to summarize what this means in a different way? Anyone?
Economic power and political power are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, that would be one way to look at it, and that increasingly economic power is becoming more powerful than political power. In fact, it's informing politics, and it has for many, many decades. And, you know, this is not new. The absence of democracy in economics is a permanent threat to the survival of democracy in politics. And so co-ops have often been motivated through periods of inequality, through periods of disruption. And I just want to show you this graph here from the previous almost 100 years, demonstrating wealth inequality in the United States. And it was in these periods, like in the early part of the 20th century, and more recently, where that economic power trumped political power. It had more influence over politics than ever before. Whereas this period in the middle, known as the Great Compression, was when the American middle class formed. Because after these disruptions, like from the Gilded Age and the Great Depression, there were programs and social programs that responded to that, what was very high wealth inequality, to start to level out the economy and level out that equality. And you had more and more people able to make a living, and what that also meant is, there was more stability. And so this is also connected to democracy, is that the level of prosperity in a society is proportional to the democratic distribution of power. So back in these two peaks, democratic distribution of power had started to lean more towards the tycoons of the early 20th century, and now more recently, the billionaires of today's time. And so the level of prosperity in a society is proportional to the democratic distribution of power. Conversely, the level of privilege and economic disparity in a society is proportional to its absence. And so this is where, over time, people have started to organize themselves in counter movements, create counterculture, create programs and services and businesses that could start to respond to that absence. And co-ops are democratic institutions, which I'll describe in just a moment. And where this starts to twin forces with economics is, I think, captured in this quote. What truly conditions how people live and what societies will become is the degree to which people can exercise control over their lives, and economics is central to this. So this is where we start to see that democracy and democratic values and principles can actually merge with economic initiatives like businesses that are democratic. And so this is why I got so interested in wanting to write about what has been hundreds of years of co-op development from around the world, but more specifically focusing on grocery and on food. And so, the easiest way to describe what a co-op is, particularly a consumer co-op, is that we look at the businesses and services that we rely on, like all the ones I just mentioned. So we're talking about some of the most important businesses and services: financial, like banks; fuel; media; food processing; grocery. These are all the most important businesses and services that we rely on. And what people over time have come to is this recognition that we, the people, want to control these important businesses and services. And so rather than rely on this very vulnerable political system that can change every 4 years that we are dependent upon, we can actually have some greater stability by ensuring that rather than having to vote every 4 years for institutions that then influence these important businesses and services, we just own them ourselves. And we bring democratic values into that by, just as the case is with your co-op and with my co-ops, once a year we get to vote for the board of directors, who are people just like all of you, who can run for the board, and you can govern your business, your store, your gas station, your flour mill. And so that's the design, and that's co-ops in a nutshell, the same with your credit unions as well. So I became so passionate about this because of how important I believe they are. I ended up buying a van to promote my book and put the cover of my book on the side of the van and traveled all across the US, which is when I first would have visited Hillsboro back in 2019. And on the back of my van, I had a question: who owns your grocery store? Some of you may have already seen this. This is another publication that I put out, which were photos from that trip to help support communities to not just read about what a co-op is, but to visualize what a co-op is. And you might recognize the one that made it on the cover if you've been out to Astoria, another older co-op from, I believe, early 1980s. And inside, many images of co-ops of all shapes and sizes. And the other initiative that came out of that trip as well was realizing, well, I needed to know where I was going. And so I had a great list of co-ops all over the country, and people who I would meet across the country who are part of food co-ops would tell me, just like I was doing, whenever they travel, they specifically look for food co-ops to shop at. So it sort of seemed like there should be a mobile app. for people to find food co-ops. And to describe too what it means to be a member of a food co-op for those of you who are still new to it, I'm an owner of that Kootenai co-op, the grocery store I showed. And for me, because it's an older co-op, the amount that it requires for me to become an owner was $50. If ever I leave the co-op, I get that $50 back. It's equity. And once a year, I vote for my board of directors. And that's the sort of baseline of that democratic process. There's much more that co-ops are doing democratically. The simple act of shopping at a co-op is, I think, a very democratic process as well. But that's the essence of what makes a co-op so different from any other grocery store. And I want to speak to as well how long your co-op has been working at this for 10 years. And 10 years is what produced this co-op that just opened last year in Detroit. In a community in Detroit that had been without a full-service grocery store, in a community that had historically been underserved as a predominantly black community, and many different groups in that community began to organize, and 10 years later, just last year, opened the Detroit People's Food Co-op. So don't be discouraged that it's taken 10 years to get here. Many startups do take this long to eventually open their doors. Equally, things can happen really fast. And again, that's what I'm hoping comes out of tonight, is new momentum, because what happened here on Marrowstone Island up in Washington State, just near Port Townsend, is this store, which has been around for 125 years, had a fire. The owners were nearing retirement, and they wanted to get out of the business. And so the community rallied together in a very short period of time, raised $300,000 to buy the store, to buy the business, use the co-op model. They now have 550 owners, and today, as of last year, it is their community-owned grocery store. And this happened within the span of less than, I think, a year and a half. And this is what that store looks like inside. So, I mentioned all these different types of co-ops, and what compelled me to choose food is, well, for one, I was coming out of work as a journalist in food. This is me filming a television series that I produced and wrote called Deconstructing Dinner, Reconstructing Our Food System. And why I'm so interested in seeing food as the vehicle for change is that it's something we can all get together around. And it's something that really helps bring community together more than I think anything else. And what also compelled me to want to focus more on grocery stores, because my radio show and my television show was very broad, why I wanted to become more focused on grocery stores is because these are much more powerful institutions than I think we give them credit for. Most often, the dominant relationship to these stores is these are places where we buy food. This is a business that sells food. But these businesses are so much more. As I came to realize through all the work I did understanding the food system, I came to believe, as I do now, that grocery stores are the most powerful institutions shaping human health. This is the primary place where we access nourishment. Grocery stores are the most influential institutions shaping our planet, our environment, our climate. They're either agents of economic extraction, like a national or multinational chain that extracts wealth out of a community, or they recirculate wealth within a community. And lastly, they are the most influential institutions shaping food supply chains. So the way I encourage us to visualize this is to see the entire food supply chain as a series of bottlenecks. And so all of this food that's getting produced globally is going through this series of bottlenecks, generally controlled by just a handful of companies represented by these numbers. And the retailer bottleneck is usually 5 companies in any one country that really dominate that market. And so it's really these companies that determine the future of the food system, because they decide what makes it to market and what doesn't. That is an immense power to have. And so just as an example, here in the US, sure enough, there are 5 companies that control about 63% of the grocery market, Walmart having 30% of the grocery market. And in Canada, very similar. In fact, it's even more concentrated. Loblaw and Sobeys having almost half of the market, the top 5 having 76% of the market. And you start to get into smaller communities where Walmart is really the only grocer and has a true monopoly in some of these communities that you see here. So in imagining how consumers and communities can exercise power in the marketplace, this is that bottleneck where we can start to open it up and allow for more foods to flow through, and where we start to be able to, as eaters, determine the future of food and the future of the food system and have more choice as to what we want to have in our grocery stores. And so this power I often imagine as being what I call the food systems control center. So that little bottleneck there for retailers, this is what I imagine is NASA mission control, and all the companies determining the future of the food system are the biggest grocers in the US and in Canada. And the other reason why I'm so passionate about the co-op model can be told through this story. So this was the first natural foods chain in Western Canada that started in the 1980s, Capers Markets. And because it was privately owned, it meant that it could be sold. And so these owners did decide to sell it to an American-based company, Alfalfa's, believing that the values would be preserved. But then Alfalfa's got purchased by Wild Oats. And then Wild Oats, who purchased Wild Oats? Whole Foods. And who owns Whole Foods? You know where this is going? So this is where this is going. This is what these three stores look like today. So those founding owners who really operated their stores with concern for community, concern for their workers, concern for their suppliers, all of a sudden, it was now owned by one of the largest companies in the world. And those co-founders never would have imagined that this is what would have happened. And so there's something within that model that makes it so that we can't protect these grocery stores that are in our community. And of course, like I say, this impacts the people selling into the store. So these are all folks that sell into my food co-op. All of a sudden, they're not dealing with a local business anymore. They're dealing with a multinational company. It affects workers, like this quite upset worker, which I found stock footage of. And so never before has a food co-op been sold to private interests. And the reason is that in order to do that, it would have to be a vote by its owners, and never before have owners voted to sell their store to private interests. And that's not to say food co-ops don't fail. Food co-ops can fail like any other business, but they are by and large far more resilient than any privately owned business because food co-ops are more than just grocery stores, which I'll get to in a little bit here. And so again, I mentioned, what is also unique is that co-ops are democratic institutions. So we vote on the future of our store. This is an election at a co-op here in Minneapolis where 17 people are running for the board. So this idea, like you see in headlines, and we've seen hundreds of headlines like this in Canada over the past 5 years, in particular, this idea that independent grocers are a dying breed. Well, there's something we can do to help preserve and protect independent grocers, of which co-ops are. Co-ops are independent grocers. And the other piece that really connects to this is this word accountability. And I think this is one of the most important in speaking of the power of grocery stores. Who's holding these grocery stores accountable to human health, the environment, their impacts on the food system, and their impacts on our local economies? More or less nobody. Despite this power that I mentioned earlier, nobody is holding our grocery stores accountable, despite how important they are. So again, what we do as consumers is we get to hold our grocery stores accountable, and we get to have a say in how that store serves human health, the environment, our local economy, food supply chains. Or as might be the case with this very unique idea of a relationship here, you get to work with a partner grocer in also having some of that influence and say within the future of your co-op and your grocery store. So again, this is where this idea of cooperatives democratizing the economy comes from. I'm just going to fast forward through these because I want to make sure we have enough time. So a headline like this, why Canada is taking regulatory action against your local grocery chain. This is because people in Canada over the past few years have been demanding accountability and have been demanding from the Canadian government to hold grocers accountable, particularly around food prices and inflation. as has been the case, I know, here in the US as well. But rather than, again, have to rely on government or government institutions to do that, we get to do that ourselves. So my co-op holds town hall meetings. My grocery store holds town hall meetings where the community is invited to come and speak to their representatives, which are the board of directors, right? And the managers as well who run the store. And so generally a co-op, just so you understand the structure of most co-ops, is they function like most grocery stores. There's a manager, there is a leadership team, and then there are staff. And the governing body, the board, employs the general manager and only has communication with the general manager. So the board is representing the members, is communicating directly through the general manager, and the general manager is reporting to the board. Or, as might be the case in this unique relationship you're imagining here in Hillsboro, it would be a very similar arrangement, but with an operator, a grocer who's operating the store. And I want to speak a bit too about price, affordability, and trust, because this is one of the most important concerns, certainly has always been the case, but now more than ever. And one thing that's important is that food co-ops cannot profit off of their customers. And so while in a partnership there might be a group profiting, food co-ops are also enjoying those profits, as is the case with all co-ops across the country that are also operating their stores. Store profits are customer profits. And one of the ways to describe this and imagine this is that a food co-op generates profits, then the management team at a food co-op and the board, they decide what to do with those profits. Oftentimes they get reinvested back into the business, which is also the case with a locally owned independent private grocer, where they'll reinvest them back into the business and everyone benefits in the community. Same at a co-op. Or in the case of some co-ops, when they're able, if they're not trying to save for some future renovation or big capital project, they're going to return some of that to their owners. So this year I got $20. So I hope you're not here because you think this is a retirement savings plan. But it is this way in which it's almost like the grocery store, and it's based on how much I've purchased. So it's as if the grocery store is saying to me at the end of the year, I want to apologize. It looks like we charged you a little too much, and I want to give you a little bit back. So $20 is not a lot, but it's certainly a very strong reminder that this is a very different type of grocery store that is going to keep money circulating in my community. And so once again, another headline, when I look at headlines like this, lawmakers should push grocery industry for transparency on profits. Once again, the food co-op model responds to that by offering that transparency to its owners. And so, when I'm seeing prices, and this is really the front lines of our grocery experience, oftentimes it's the first thing we see. So when I walked into my co-op not too long ago and I saw this amazing deal, 2 for $7 for these K-Pasta chips, I didn't see it as a gimmick trying to pull me in and lure me in. I actually knew that there were people in the offices upstairs who were working with our suppliers, like this company here, or our distributors, trying to get the best prices possible, not because they want to retain me as a customer, but because they actually care about me and my economic well-being, because they're also shopping at the store, because they also live in the community, because they know who I am. And so it's a very different relationship that I have to the prices. And because I know that the store is not trying to extract all the wealth out of my pocketbook, I also feel a level of trust in knowing that these are the best prices that the store can offer me, and they're doing their best. And case in point, as far as comparing the pricing at food co-ops to any other stores, these are the 3 big competitors our co-op, where I live, compete with, owned by the 3 largest grocers in Canada. And you can see here that we are highly competitive, at least in this one instance. And so it's important to be cautious when you're seeing prices, because this here is in the Loblaw-owned store near me, where it appears that this must be a good price because the number is so big. But as you see, we're charging, generally actually, those chips are about $4.50, $5 at the most at our store. And so I've done price comparisons between the Loblaw-owned store and our co-op. You can see here that Our co-op is highly price competitive. I don't want you to go through all of them, but just look at the bottom. 209 on the left, 216 if you can't see that there. And similarly, the co-op up in Bellingham, they do the same thing, where they compare it to their largest competitors, which in their case is Fred Meyer, Whole Foods, Hagen. And you can see here in some departments they're very competitive, other departments not as much. But food co-ops have really demonstrated that they can be very price competitive with the largest grocers in the country. And so co-ops, just to give you a sense as to the movement and how big it is, there are 325 co-op owned stores across the US. Some of those co-ops have multiple locations. And like I said earlier too, most of the co-ops that exist today, the strongest ones, the biggest ones, have all emerged from the 1970s. Many are celebrating their 50th anniversaries, 55th anniversaries. This is the first store at PCC in Seattle. This is from the 1960s. Today, PCC is the largest food co-op in the US with 15 stores. And every co-op is different. You know, this isn't something where you go from town to town and you see the exact same design of the Safeway or the Walmart. Every co-op, as you can see here, is quite different. They all have the same van, yeah. And oftentimes, I should mention, as I was touring, I would be sleeping in the van in the co-op parking lots. Yeah, it was all set up in the back with the bed, with the bed. And this is the co-op that I joined in 2006. This is what it looked like in 2006, the Kootenai Co-op, also from 1975. This is what it looked like in 2016 with the new paint job. And we were in this building for 25 years and grew really fast. We went from $6 million in sales when I got there to $14 million in 2016. And we really needed to move into a new space. And so we did what every startup co-op does, is we launched a capital campaign and asked our owners to support the construction of a new store. And so about 180 of our owners lent anywhere between $1,000 upwards of $250,000, 1.8 million lent to the co-op, which then signaled to our other, in this case, credit unions, that we were serious, and the credit unions put in the rest, and even our builder, who cared a lot about what we were doing because we were a co-op, they also became an equity investor in what we were doing. And so people who did lend had anywhere between 3.5% to 4% interest rates on those loans with terms of like 5 to 7 years. And our co-op was able to then pay all those members back. I think it was within about a 6-year period that all the members got paid back. Now, again, you know, our co-op was a bit more secure in our ability to do that because we had, at that point, 30-year-old business, or almost 35-year-old business. But we were successful, and we built a new store, and this is, again, what our store looks like today because of that success. So this was built by our community, by the money in our community. And what I've noticed across the U.S. is that startups who have that commitment in their community, the money is always there. It's a matter of whether we see this as something that is worthy of our contribution and with a little bit of risk as well. But co-ops that have that commitment have all been very successful, and a few out there have not been as successful. But from what I can tell here with your site selection and with the understanding I have of what this community is capable of, like I see this as being a very successful cooperative. And this is what it looks like inside the store. So we've gotten to a point now where we're employing 160 people in the store. And this is our produce department. This is our gathering space, our cafe. So co-ops aren't just grocery stores, they're places to gather. We can use this space to hold events. And what our co-op has also started to do is make a lot of food on site. So it also means we can be more specific as to the ingredients that go into all of the foods you see here, which are made in the kitchen by people like Birher here, who's actually my next door neighbor where I live, who also works in the store, in the co-op as one of the bakers. And our meat department is also something that's quite unique. So, you know, just like a grocery store from many years ago would have been butchering all their own meats on site, our co-op is now doing that. And so everything you see here is actually being made inside the store. and smoked as well inside the store. And some co-ops are acquiring bakeries. So this food co-op in La Crosse, Wisconsin, acquired a bakery that was going to go out of business. This co-op here in Keene, New Hampshire, acquired this building here in the front as a food production facility. So food co-ops are also vertically integrating into the supply chain, not just selling food, but also getting into food production. And co-ops respond to community needs. So this co-op here in Plainfield, Vermont, they also needed a bigger space. There weren't too many locations around. Turned out the hardware store was looking to retire. And so they bought the hardware store, which also has a garden center. And now the community owns a hardware store, a garden center, and a grocery store. And co-ops, this is a newer one from the previous 15 years. This is East Aurora, New York State, near Buffalo. And the other important piece, too, with co-ops is oftentimes co-ops appear to be synonymous with natural and organic foods. And that is often the case in the U.S., but it's not always the case. And so a co-op like People's Food Co-op, which has 2 stores, one here in Rochester, Minnesota, because they're the only grocery store in the downtown of Rochester, Minnesota, they want to be as accessible to the whole community as possible. So when you walk into the produce department, you have organic produce on the right and conventional produce on the left. And other ways that co-ops respond to community need, particularly for lower income residents, is to offer education and encouragement like these cards, which have a recipe and all the ingredients you need for $10 or less, $15 or less. And here's just one example, too, of a co-op that is not a natural organic food co-op. This is a co-op in what was a food desert in Dayton, Ohio, that now has a full-service grocery store, and their entire grocery store is almost entirely conventional. And the other important piece with co-ops, too, is how much money they return to their communities. So our co-op gives to all of these organizations through donations, through grants. Pretty much every nonprofit and community organization in our community is receiving something from our co-op, whether it's a church group or a choir or a soccer club or a gymnastics club. And what's also really important that this on the right captures is, as long as I've been part of our co-op 20 years now, we've been doing this program on the right every year. So once a month, one organization gets 3% of the day's sales as a contribution. So the Kootenai Organic Growers Society is one of the local certifiers for organic products in our area, representing, of course, many farmers. They receive 3% of daily sales. So in 2006, our annual sales at our co-op were $6 million. Today, they're $28 million. That 3%'s never changed. So as our co-op grows, so too does the contribution. And in that way, you can imagine that as co-ops grow, as food co-ops grow, so does the community. So the co-op helps lift up all organizations in the community, particularly through a program like this. This is about 25% of that organization's annual budget. Some co-ops realize that grocery is maybe not the priority, it's something they want to offer. So this is a very small grocery store, but where they make a higher percentage of their revenues and profits in this co-op, this is in Ontario, is through having food services, having a restaurant and catering. So this co-op is adapting to that community's needs. And other co-ops are also doing similar programs of offering meals once a week for $3 for lower income residents to come in and get a cheap meal. So these are the co-ops that are established, and of course there's many co-ops like yours that are in formation. So this is one that I visited some years ago that was in formation. They had just found a site. This is the sign on that site. This is in Woodstock, Illinois, where Groundhog Day was filmed, if you like that movie. I got to go walk through the Groundhog Day set, which is a town, an actual town. And as they were imagining their store, they got to this stage, which is the drawings. This is when people started to get more excited. More people started to sign up to become an owner. I'm sure you've had this experience here in Hillsboro of running into Hillsboro volunteers with t-shirts at markets and events. And they too, like I mentioned, had their capital campaign. They needed almost 4.5 to build the store. Marketing, like I'm sure you've also seen. Why did they invest in the co-op? And just over, I think it's a year ago now, the Food Shed Co-op opened its doors, and this is what that store looks like today. And so I want to just quickly speak about how co-ops that are independent partner with other organizations that support them. Because in a world of Walmarts and Kroger's and Albertsons, it's very hard for independents to compete. Some do it really well, others do need support. So many independent grocers are also owners of distributors, as is the case with many independents. They'll own a distributor with many other independents. And so co-ops have done that through National Co-op Grocers. And so Astoria Co-op, for example, is a member of National Co-op Grocers. There are 160 of the co-ops in the US that are members of National Co-op Grocers. So this is a co-op of co-ops, National Co-op Grocers. And so they have their own map of where their members are, but it's mostly the largest of the co-ops. And so you might see in some co-ops this kind of co-branding, where it's the similar brand at all the co-ops through these deals, because what that co-op is doing for its members, for its independent stores, is brokering deals on behalf of their independents to get pricing that's almost like they're a chain. So through their major distributors, they're able to get prices, which is why they're so competitive. Or some of the cheaper products like Co-op Basics. And so in Canada, there's other similar partnerships that have happened, sometimes with conventional grocers. So many of the co-ops in Canada are more conventional when it comes to the products on their shelves. So these two co-ops in the eastern part of Canada get most of their food from Sobeys, and they also brand alongside Sobeys' IGA brand or their Foodland brand. And then you also see Co-op, which is their own brand as well. So this is not uncommon in Canada, but it is unique when it comes to the US that there's co-ops partnering like this. This co-op in Quebec, Convivio, they are a successful co-op from the 1930s with 4 locations, and each of their locations is co-branded almost as if it's a franchise with Sobeys' IGA brand, right? But again, you see the name of the co-op, and you see the name of IGA as well. And so you might see certain IGA private labels, or you might see a private label that's unique to the co-op, Convivio. Like you would say at New Seasons, you see the New Seasons private label. And another one in Canada is in Western Canada. So this is a co-op in Edmonton with 4 locations. And all the co-ops in Western Canada, except mine and a handful of others, also own Federated Co-op, which is their distributor. And so again, this is a similar arrangement to a lot of the independents in the US. And so whereas some co-ops in Canada will brand with the same brand all across the country, others will maintain some level of independence, and so their logo has that brand, but the store itself looks like your stereotypical 1970s era co-op, right? So this one actually is up on Hornby Island in British Columbia. Been around since, the 1950s. So I want to run just quickly through these last slides. Does anyone really need to leave right at 8? I know we started a little late. Okay, so I want to just offer like some ideas for how you talk about co-ops and how you might want to communicate this to others in your community. And then hopefully then we'll have some time for some questions and to hear from a few other folks. So I just want to run through these here. So why food co-ops? If someone's asking you, why is a food co-op important? I think one of the most common experiences that we've now all had in recent years is how vulnerable our supply chains really are. We've all experienced empty shelves. Most of us probably remember when one boat disrupted 15% of the global economy when it got stuck in the Suez Canal. More recently, not a food-related example, but one simple upload of software disrupted technology all over the planet, shutting down airports and airlines. So there was a lot of risk in the centralization of our economy. In Canada, we see that risk. We saw this risk because our beef sector is highly concentrated. Somehow the map didn't appear on here. There's actually a map of Canada. I'll just draw it. Yeah. Oh, it's on those screens. Okay, somehow it didn't appear on that screen. Well, there you go. So just look at those screens. 2 companies control 95% of the beef in Canada. And so when, during the pandemic, there were outbreaks in those facilities, Canada's beef supply just came to a halt. Or when those workers wanted to strike, there was a risk that Canada's beef supply would also come to a halt. So I'm coming back to these numbers about grocers. Grocers also have a highly concentrated grip on the food system. So again, there's vulnerability in that. So while it is nice to talk about buying local, I think there's also this language of having a reliable and resilient supply chain, a more diverse supply chain. And so I've shifted how I talk about food co-ops to not just talk about how it's important to buy local and support local producers, but how this is also an effort to have a reliable and resilient supply chain. The other one, coming back to what I was sharing earlier, is durability. If we want a grocery store to remain committed to our community, this co-op model is a way to protect independent grocers and protect us and all that we invest in the store, to protect workers, to protect suppliers. So again, remember this story here. Protecting the suppliers, protecting the workers. So this is a story that I think is important to tell. New Seasons Market is an example, of course, of a grocer that emerged here in Oregon that is now owned by a South Korean company. So it used to say your local grocer at this store I visited some years ago. It's no longer locally owned, although it is locally managed. It's a subsidiary. Does anyone know this grocer? So Roth's mostly in Salem, south of Portland, is now owned by a Canadian grocery giant as of this year, Jim Pattison Group. So again, having some local examples. So Capers Markets in Vancouver, well, that might not be as relevant, but there are now some local examples of how these independent grocers might be acquired. Do you know Chuck's Produce across in Vancouver, Washington? Also now owned by the Jim Pattison Group, one of the 3 largest grocers in Western Canada that's moving into the US. So this idea of durability, one way to speak of it is that the future of a privately owned grocer is determined by a single individual, family, or company. Again, like I shared earlier, never before has a food co-op been acquired by private interests. Why? Because any sale would need to be a vote by the owners. So the co-op model protects independent alternatives and diversity within the food supply chain. The other this is a bit of a recap too of some of what I was sharing, is this word accountability, that no one is holding our grocers accountable for their influence on health, the food supply chain, the environment, and economies, nor holding them accountable for how they price their food. So the co-op model empowers customers in this way. Another way I often describe the democratic underpinnings of a co-op is that we are democratizing the economy. We are bringing democratic principles and values into the businesses and services we use. So one way to talk about that is that we vote in elections so we can influence the institutions that have the greatest effect on our lives, but there's no assurance that who I vote for will make any effort to support me and my grocery needs. At a food co-op, I can bypass that uncertainty and vote instead for the governance of the grocery store. And I would also have direct access to the people who run the store. Through the co-op model, we embed democratic principles into an economic institution, and we use that economic engine to serve the needs of people and communities and to drive social change. We're simply changing the venue of where democracy lives. And you can make it personal. So I think it's quite valuable when we talk about what is a co-op to ask the question, who here is an owner of a bank? Who here is a member of a credit union? So use examples of other co-ops that you're a part of to bring some familiarity. So these here are all co-ops. REI, Ace Hardware. So Ace Hardware, each store is generally independently owned, and all those independent stores own Ace Hardware as their distributor and the brand. Ocean Spray is a farmer co-op. Blue Diamond Almonds, also Organic Valley, farmer co-op. I'm going to fast forward through these because I want to make sure we have enough time. And the other one that I've also found to be quite impactful is every community, Hillsboro, where I live, have these grocery trucks, like this Safeway truck that comes into my community. So we have Safeway. It's owned by Sobeys in Canada. But I used to just see these trucks coming in and not think much of them. And now, as I see them, they are coming in filled with food. They empty the truck into the back of the store, into the back of the Safeway, and we often imagine they must be leaving empty. But I now understand that they're actually leaving with our community's wealth. And so I encourage people to imagine this. And so when I'm talking about why is a food co-op important, I might tell them this story. Hey, you know those Safeway trucks that are coming into the community, or the Walmart truck that's coming into the community? When they leave, they are taking all of our community's wealth out of this community. So this is this idea of a leaky economy. So something simple like a visual like that, for me, has had profound effect. That when I see these trucks, I don't just see them in my peripheral anymore. There's something really important that they represent. And it's also a way to move from this idea that when we shop at a grocery store, this is an expense, this is a cost. And when we start to understand what co-ops do and how we keep money in our communities to then recirculate, we're actually making an investment. So that changes the whole relationship at the checkout. And so this is also something that we can talk to each other about that's quite simple. You know, it's not an expense, it's an investment. And I spoke to this earlier too, the language of we. That when speaking of your co-op, for those of you who are now owners and members, to really make sure you're using this language of we, because it starts to take it away from the dominant relationship of businesses and services being they, that they're doing this, that they're doing this. And sometimes even within a co-op, you might say, you might refer to your co-op as, yeah, they're looking at that site down the road. But if you're a member, you can say, we are looking at a site down the road. And it starts to, again, change the narrative as to our relationship with our grocery store and with the businesses that we use. And then the other important way to talk about co-ops is that they are more than just grocery stores. So as with some of what I've shared, you can now see that co-ops are actually community development organizations. They generate value in a community. I've met so many people across the country who tell me that when they moved from, say, Portland to Seattle, the first thing they did was look at where is the food co-op because I want to live near that food co-op. And so it starts to generate value for neighborhoods because this is what people are looking for. It's a gathering space. They are local economic development agencies supporting independent businesses, incubating them. They're hubs of wellness. They often offer kitchen and food education and literacy. Often they're advocates for causes, and they help support other co-ops, and they're often supporting workers beyond a living wage. I know that the Fred Meyer had some strikes recently. So I met someone from a local co-op in Portland, and she was telling me that the workers who were striking in the parking lot were telling all the people who were coming to shop, you should just go to the co-op because they take care of their workers. And this is what I just heard yesterday. And so this is the other pieces, you know, co-ops are generally supporting their workers, as are independent grocers generally supporting their workers better because we all live in the community together. And this makes co-ops resilient. So this is that piece I was mentioning, that one of the reasons why co-ops don't close as frequently as privately owned grocers is because they are doing more for the community. It's not just the bottom line. So Kroger might close a store not because it's not profitable, it's just not making enough money to keep it open. And this is often the case. Co-ops don't do that. Co-ops will do whatever they can to remain in business, even if it means just breaking even. But co-ops are for-profit businesses, and that's something that's important. It's just what we do with those profits that's different. So similar to, I think, your slogan. What's your slogan under Hillsboro, under your sign? Hillsboro Food Co-op? It's similar. Own a grocery store with me. Yeah, I think that's what I saw. So this is something we've done on the back of our shirts. I own a grocery store with my friends. So I hope soon you will have these shirts. For now, it's own a grocery store with me on your signs. And if you haven't yet seen this and you'd like to look at more food co-ops across the country, this is a publication that's available online. You certainly can go to my website to find it, or you could scan that QR code right now and flip through the pages. And so why don't we move on to wherever you wanted to move on to and introduce whoever you wanted to move on to. And I'm not going to be going anywhere after this, and so there was some talk of maybe hanging out afterwards to chat and answer questions. And lastly, when you're traveling, and if you want to find a food co-op, I encourage you to download my Food Co-op Finder mobile app so you can get a feel for what food co-ops are, and because they're all over the country, and so you'll get a chance to be able to find them using this app. So thank you very much. I'm going to wish you all wonderful success. Thank you. Okay, sure.
Thank you so much. I feel super privileged to be able to listen and learn from Jon's experience. And for me in particular, I think some of the stories about Canada's partnerships with grocers is really encouraging because it shows that there is a blueprint for what we're trying to do. I don't want to keep you guys in those chairs for too long, so I have a couple quick announcements and then an introduction. First thing, super exciting, we're looking for more board members. I know from our survey a couple months ago that people were interested. If any of you are interested in being a board member, please either send an info at hillsborofoodcoop.com. We have an email going out Monday. That's when the application will go live, so please watch your inboxes. It'll have links to that. We'll be sending those emails out a couple times over the next month. But we really encourage any of you that were inspired by what you saw today and you want to help make this Block 67 location happen, please apply to the board. We can use all the help we can get right now. This is a super critical time for us. One other thing is that we do have some HFC swag in the back if you want to kind of a pay what you can donation, and you can pick something up to take home. Also, stickers and magnets, please just grab one on your way out. That's free advertising for us, so please take one of those. And I do want to thank the volunteers that are here that helped make this happen, as well as thank Jon for his time. He was able to come out from Portland since he was here, and I really appreciate him being able to add Hillsboro onto his trip. All right, and now I just want to introduce really quickly. We have, sorry, I think I pushed something. We have the CEO from Fresh Foods here. Jon, you want to come up or do you want to wave? Either way. So this is a locally owned grocer, a small scale grocer that, we heard some stories about in Jon's slideshow. And I want to give you guys a couple quick facts about Fresh Foods just because I think a lot of us are still new to Fresh Foods and what their philosophy is. The ownership and management have Hillsboro ties, so it's not just somebody coming in from elsewhere to open up a store and leave again. Fresh Foods has a private label, which they strive to source as locally to the Pacific Northwest as possible. Some examples of that: their private label coffee is from Hillsboro's own Long Bottom. Beer is from Double Mountain in Hood River and Narrows Brewing in Seattle. And their granola is from White Pine, which is an Oregon brand. So just a few examples, but they are working hard to source locally when possible. Another thing is that they've expressed interest in adopting our mission and values, and we're currently working through how to define this in the LLC agreement between the co-op and Fresh Foods. They've also expressed a lot of commitment to transparency, and they have some ideas about ways that owners can be involved, meetings that owners can attend. They are definitely interested in keeping the owners and the co-op best interest at heart and being totally transparent with those decisions. So that's all been really encouraging information to hear as we've been talking to Fresh Foods and trying to work through some of the logistics of getting this store open at Block 67. And I believe Jon will be here for a few minutes. If any of you guys want to just come up and introduce yourselves or say hi. And I don't know, do you want to say anything now or are you?
I appreciate the opportunity to come here tonight. Jon, thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. I just want to let everybody know in forthrightness is our goal is to help give the Hillsboro Food Co-op the horsepower to execute what their board wants to execute. This is not about profits. This is about doing something that's going to be sustainable. Yes, where there will be benefits for people, there will. It'll be for the entire community. That's how we operate as a business. So, thank you.
And then one last note on the Block 67 front. We've been meeting with Coase, the developer, every other week, and they're currently in the process of choosing other tenants for their ground floor spaces. The co-op would be in one of the ground floor spaces of that development, and they've just shown us that they're being really proactive and really accommodating to us. They're trying to choose something that would be complementary to our business and not competitive. They're trying to make sure, are you guys planning on having an inside coffee shop? If so, we don't want to put a coffee shop right next door. So just to let you guys know that they are really concerned about our business model and working with us. So that's an awesome positive update on our end. And I just wanted to pass that on to you guys. So hopefully we have more information forthcoming in emails, and we can set up a couple more town hall type events too, so that you guys can get to know Fresh Foods a little better and learn a little bit more about where we are in the process with Co's development. All right, that's all for tonight. I will let you guys, mill about, ask questions, come say hi, come get some swag. And if people feel strongly enough, we can move over to like high ground or something and have a couple drinks and keep talking if you guys want. So,
Will John answer any questions?
will John answer any questions?
If there's interest, yeah.
Yeah.
I also brought 3 books with me. I only have 3 left. They were quite successful at the conference. So if you'd like a signed copy, come find me. They're $25.
Yeah,
And if you want to create time?
we can
Yep.
stay until they kick us out. So, yeah, please. Thank you so much again for coming.
Yes, so let's chat a bit. Sure.